Right now, on the big island of Hawaii, lava is climbing higher into the sky than it was an hour ago. This isn't a forecast anymore. The U.S. Geological Survey confirmed it directly. Kilauea's fountain started at about 100 feet this morning. By 10:30, they'd already climbed to 950 feet, and Hawaii County Civil Defense says they're still building. That's taller than most 80-story buildings, rising out of a single crater right now as you're watching this. This is episode 51. Yeah, the one we've been watching build toward for 2 weeks straight. It finally started at 8:30 this morning and it has not stopped climbing since. 2 weeks of buildup and it still isn't slowing down as we speak. By the end of this, you'll know exactly how high it's gone, how scientists actually called the timing right, and what happens if these fountains keep climbing past anything this volcano has done in decades. No guessing, no dramatizing. Just what's confirmed as it happens. Here's exactly where the numbers stand right now, according to HVO's own notices. Episode 51 began at 8:30 in the morning, Hawaii time, on July 15th, from the north vent inside Halemamau crater. Fountain height at the very start was about 100 feet. Within 2 hours, it had climbed to 160 feet. Then it kept climbing straight through to 950 feet. That's about 290 meters by 10:30 that same morning. A fusion, that's how fast lava is actually pouring out, peaked around 400 cubic yards per second, about 300 cubic meters per second, at that same 10:30 mark. Right, that's roughly in the same range episode 50 hit at its own peak 3 weeks ago, so this one came in strong right from the start. The ash and gas plume above it has reached 18,000 feet, confirmed by the National Weather Service's aviation radar, drifting southwest. Now, here's something worth pausing on. Even with fountains at 950 feet and a plume that tall, HVO kept the volcano alert level at watch and the aviation color code at orange. Not the highest tier. Look, that actually matters because it tells you this specific combination of height and plume, dramatic as it looks, still falls inside the range HVO has planned for. Not a level they consider maximum hazard. On the ground, winds are blowing 5 to 10 miles per hour out of the east-northeast, pushing gas and tephra toward the southwest, into the Kau district. Very light peels hair, these fine glassy volcanic threads, has already been reported at the Kau Desert trailhead along Highway 11. Most of the heavier tephra fall is still landing inside the closed section of the national park. So here's the actual open question right now, the one nobody, not even HVO, can answer yet. How much higher does this one climb, and how long does it actually run? Because past episodes in this exact sequence have lasted anywhere from 4.5 hours to 6 full days. Right now, this one is still going. To understand how scientists actually got the timing right on this, and why it took 2 straight weeks of false starts to get here, you have to go back about half a mile under that crater floor. That's where the magma actually lives before any of this reaches the surface. There's a shallow magma reservoir sitting roughly 500 to 700 meters down. That's about 1/3 to 4/10 of a mile beneath Halemamau. Scientists compare it to a balloon. Magma keeps pushing in from deeper in the earth. The ground above swells because something has to give, and eventually the rock just cannot hold anymore. It gives way all at once and you get a fountain. Then the vent plugs itself back up with cooler, heavier lava, and the whole cycle starts rebuilding again, almost immediately. Here's how you actually measure that swelling before it happens. HVO uses something called a borehole tilt meter, buried underground, sensitive enough to detect a change of 1/10 of a microradian. Look, 1 microradian is the kind of slope you'd get by taking a board a kilometer long, about 6/10 of a mile, and sliding a dime under one end of it. That's the scale we're talking about. A whisper of movement in solid rock. Now here's where it actually gets interesting, because the lead up to this exact eruption was messier than a clean countdown. On July 4th, tilt recovery sat at 7.8 microradians and climbing. By July 10th, it had reached 14.1. By the morning of July 11th, it hit 15.3, basically right at the historical threshold where fountaining usually kicks off. And then it stalled. Deflation interrupted the climb, and the recovery actually dropped back down to 13.6 microradians by July 13th. HVO's forecast window kept sliding because of it. July 7th to 14th, then July 9th to 14th, then July 11th to 13th, then July 13th to 15th, then finally July 14th to 16th. Sit with that for a second. This volcano teased the threshold, backed off, teased it again, and made scientists revise the forecast 5 separate times before it actually went. That's not a failure of the science, honestly. That's the science working exactly as designed, adjusting in real time as the ground itself kept changing its mind. Here's the part that's honestly a little humbling for that tilt number, too. When the overflow actually started on July 14th, tilt recovery hadn't even fully climbed back into that 15 to 16 microradian range yet. It was still sitting below the historical threshold. The visual signal ended up being the trigger that actually mattered most this time, not the number on the tilt meter. Seismometers across the summit had also picked up rising tremor in the hours before that overflow, the kind of shift HVO watches for before every episode in this sequence, short scattered bursts giving way to sustained shaking across the whole network. That's the other half of the call. That visual signal was simple, though, and it's the one that actually pulled the trigger. On July 14th at 2:51 in the afternoon, the north vent produced a lava overflow. That was the call. HVO immediately raised the alert from advisory to watch, and the color code from yellow to orange that same afternoon. Precursory activity like that can run for hours or days before the real fountain starts. This time, it ran for about 18 hours. At 8:30 the next morning, July 15th, episode 51 began for real. And there's one more thing rattling underneath all of this, completely separate from anything we just walked through. About 15 to 40 kilometers down, that's roughly 9 to 25 miles beneath the surface, near a town called Pahala, there's been a persistent swarm of deep earthquakes. Some people online have connected that swarm to something a lot scarier than a lava fountain. We're going to get to exactly what that claim is, and why the geology doesn't support it in a few minutes. Yeah, this isn't the first time Kilauea has done this, but here's how today actually stacks up against the record books. Go back to November of 1959. For 37 days, a vent inside a pit crater called Kilauea Iki, right next to the summit, went through the same rhythm. Fountain, pause, 17 times total. One of those fountains reached 580 meters into the air. That's about 1,900 feet. To put that somewhere your brain can actually hold it, that's taller than the Empire State Building, and it's still the tallest fountain ever recorded in Hawaii's history. The current sequence has gotten close before. Episode 50, less than 3 weeks ago, reached 1,030 feet, the tallest of the entire year until today. Right now, at last confirmed check, episode 51 sits at 950 feet and was still building. That's already taller than most skyscrapers on Earth, and it still hasn't caught up to episode 50, let alone 1959's record. Look, duration is just as wild a swing as height here. Episode 50 lasted 7 hours, start to finish. Other episodes in the same sequence have run as short as 4.5 hours, or as long as 6 straight days. There's genuinely no way to know yet which kind of episode today is going to be. Honestly, that's a wider range than almost anything else we track on this channel. 6 days versus 4.5 hours. for the exact same volcano. Here's the number that actually matters more than any single fountain height, though. This sequence isn't just tall, it's historic in a completely different way. Back in early June, episode 48 quietly did something no fountain height ever could. It pushed this sequence past 47 episodes, and that number matters because 47 was the previous record, set decades ago by an eruption called Pu back in the 1980s. This sequence didn't just match that record. It broke it, and it's kept going for 3 more episodes since. Across every one of those 51 episodes, and across a fountain taller than a skyscraper back in 1959, there has been one constant: 0 deaths. In fact, across the entire 20th century in Hawaii, only one person has ever been killed directly by a volcanic eruption, a photographer struck by debris back in 1924. That's the pattern this eruption keeps proving over and over. Summit fountaining here can be genuinely historic, can climb past records that stood for 40 years and still stay contained, as long as the system keeps doing exactly what it's done 51 times running. Now look, it's worth being straight about scale here, because this is exactly where online panic usually gets it wrong. This is not 2018. In 2018, lava left the summit entirely, moved into a residential area called Leilani Estates and destroyed over 700 homes. That is not what's happening right now. Every single one of these 51 episodes, including the one climbing right now, has stayed strictly inside Halemamau Crater, inside the boundaries of the national park. 0 homes, 0 critical infrastructure, not one structure lost across this entire sequence. So if the fear is lava reaching your street, that fear doesn't apply here. Honestly, it never really has, not for this sequence. But that doesn't mean there's nothing to watch. The real risk with this sequence was never about lava crossing into neighborhoods. It's about what rides on the wind once the fountain climbs, and we're going to get into exactly who that affects in a few minutes. Okay, remember that earthquake swarm near Pahala I mentioned earlier. Here's the claim that's actually circulating about it right now, while episode 51 is climbing. The theory says that swarm is secretly building towards something much bigger than a lava fountain. It claims the swarm is going to trigger a chunk of Kilauea's south flank, something called the Helena Slump, to collapse into the ocean all at once, and send a mega tsunami all the way across the Pacific to the U.S. West Coast. I get why that sounds scary, especially with fountains actively climbing on camera right now. Look, a volcano that's visibly this active does look unstable from the outside, but the mechanism just doesn't hold up. Here's why. The system driving these fountains sits about 500 to 700 meters down, shallow, right under the crater. The Helena Slump moves along a completely different structure, a deep fault miles below the surface. These are 2 separate systems. Geologists monitor the whole volcano constantly, and there is 0 observed connection between the shallow fountaining happening right now and any accelerated movement on that deep flank. And even in the scenario where a landslide did happen, the physics still don't support a Pacific-wide wave. Landslide-generated tsunamis lose energy fast as they travel across open ocean, exponentially, actually. To send a wave with real destructive force all the way to California, you'd need hundreds of cubic kilometers of rock to detach and hit the water almost instantly. Nothing measured at Kilauea right now, even mid-eruption, is anywhere near that scale. 2 more claims worth a quick swat while we're here. One says a nearby geothermal energy plant is somehow triggering the eruptions. It isn't. The pressure and volume involved in this system dwarfs anything a drilling operation could influence. The other tries to connect Kilauea to Yellowstone. Different continent, different tectonic setup, no shared plumbing, no mechanism at all. As for the Pahala swarm itself, That part's honestly still an open question, and USGS is upfront about it. HVO's official position is there's no proven short-term link between those deep quakes and the shallow fountaining happening at the summit right now. That's a real scientific debate. It's just not the same thing as a hidden mega tsunami. Let's be honest about who this actually touches, because a fountain climbing on a live stream means nothing if it doesn't connect to real people. Nobody's losing a home to this. We already covered that. But right now, today, this is not hypothetical for a few specific communities. Before fountaining even began, Hawaii County Civil Defense issued an advisory to residents in the Kau district, specifically Pahala and Naeahu, telling people to disconnect their water catchment systems and prepare. That catchment water is drinking water out there, so that's not a small ask. I mean, that's people physically going outside and shutting off their household supply, because a fountain a few thousand feet away might send glass fibers into it. Light Peel's hair has already been confirmed at the Kau Desert Trailhead along Highway 11, right now, during this very episode. The National Weather Service issued a special weather statement specifically about this, warning that ash and lightweight tephra could travel well beyond the park boundary depending on how the wind holds. In Volcano Village, right next to the park, fine ash in the air has repeatedly triggered real respiratory irritation, especially for anyone already sensitive, elderly residents, people with asthma, young kids. None of that shows up in a death count. But it's real, it's happening today, and it's the actual cost of living downwind of a volcano that's currently climbing past 1,000 feet. Here's the flip side, though, and it's honestly kind of remarkable. This same activity has turned into one of the biggest tourism draws Hawaii Volcanoes National Park has ever seen. Reporting tied to the park points to well over 1 million visitors in a single recent year, and a total economic impact in the hundreds of millions of dollars for nearby communities. I'll flag that one loosely, right? The precise breakdown numbers aren't fully nailed down in official reporting, but the scale of the boom itself is well documented. Days like today, with fountains climbing on live cameras, are exactly what pulls people through the park gates. So this is a volcano that's simultaneously an active, confirmed burden for a handful of small communities today, and a massive economic lifeline for the region around it. Both of those things are true at the same exact time. Look, zoom out far enough, and episode 51 isn't really its own story. It's one small climb inside something much bigger. Back in 2018, Kilauea's summit collapsed by over 500 meters, that's about 1,640 feet, as magma drained out to feed a lower rift zone eruption. That left a massive hole behind, roughly 0.8 cubic kilometers of missing volume. Every episode since has been this volcano slowly refilling that hole. This is the 51st attempt, and here's the part that already happened, not a maybe anymore. Back in early June, this exact sequence passed Pu'u's old record of 47 episodes, an eruption from the 1980s that everyone assumed would stand for a very long time. It didn't. This sequence broke it, kept going, and just produced its tallest fountain of the year in the process. Whether this eventually settles into one continuous, steady lava flow, the way Pu'u itself finally did after years of this exact rhythm, or just keeps fountaining like this indefinitely, is honestly still a question nobody can answer. But the record part isn't a question anymore. That part already happened. So go back to the number I opened with. 950 feet, confirmed by USGS as of the last check this morning. Still building, according to Hawaii County Civil Defense. Nobody knows yet if it stops there, catches up to episode 50's 1,030 feet, or keeps going past anything this sequence has produced in over 550 days. What we do know is how it got here. 2 weeks of tilt climbing, stalling, climbing again. 5 separate forecast windows. each one revised as the ground itself kept changing its mind. Then, 18 hours of precursory overflow, and a fountain that hasn't stopped rising since 8:30 this morning. That's not really a story about a prediction that came true. Honestly, it's a story about scientists reading a system in real time, getting the call right, and still not being able to tell you exactly how this particular chapter ends. Look, if you want the one thing worth actually watching next, it's simple. Does this fountain catch the 1,030-foot mark from 3 weeks ago? And does it stay confined the way all 51 episodes before it have? We'll be tracking this one as it climbs. Yeah, we'll update the second it stops or the second it breaks a record. The next number could be the one that actually answers it.